In the same sense that the significance of the Vietnam War for the Vietnamese themselves may be something quite different from the significance of the Vietnamese War for Americans, we have to recognize that the rise and fall of the Arab Spring phenomenon meant something very different for the people of Libya, for the people of Egypt, so on and so forth, than it did for the predominantly white, Western, English-speaking world. And that's what this video is about. This is not the first time I've discussed this problem on the channel, but very few members of my audience were watching perhaps 5 years ago, the last time I discussed it. I'm just checking here. My girlfriend off camera. Do you remember? I was challenging the nascent ideology of a vegan extremist movement called Direct Action Everywhere. When they first put forth their ideology here on YouTube and on the internet and writing and other formats, they explained what they were doing as learning the lessons of history, applying the methodology of the Arab Spring to the struggle to establish animal rights, to end the meat industry, and so on and so forth. At that time, so that's just about 5 years ago now, maybe now closer to 6 years, they were treating the Arab Spring as a success story. They were treating the Arab Spring as being the proof of the correctness of a theory that began with Mohandas Gandhi, also known as Mahatma Gandhi, political leader in India, as if the ideology of Gandhi had anything to do with what was happening then in Egypt and Libya and Tripoli and so on. It's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreakingly stupid. And, as if the Arab Spring were not, at that stage already, a disaster, a negative example, a tragedy that we should learn from. But that instead this was something to be celebrated, imitated, and emulated. And the strangest part of this of all is the white, Western, English-speaking attempt to kind of appropriate or grossly reinterpret the significance of the Arab Spring also rests on insinuating into the narrative of a series of key points in history, like looking up at the sky and then drawing a line between stars in the sky, insinuating into each of these points nonviolence, when the reality is that each and every one of those moments in history was defined by violence. Period. No exceptions. So, I'm sure there are philosophers right now in the Arab-speaking world, inclusive of Egypt and so on, but some of these people could be philosophizing about this in countries that didn't directly participate in the Arab Spring, but people who could read the same language used in the newspapers throughout the region and really follow what was happening in detail. I'm sure there were people drawing really meaningful philosophical conclusions about what went right and what went wrong, but all of those people know that these so-called peaceful, so-called nonviolent revolutions and changes in government, every single one of them depended on basically military-led coup d'etat. What it depended on was the military being mobilized against the government. That was the decisive step. We have a crucially important witness to the development of the white Western ideology of the Arab Spring. In a Mother Jones article from the year 2012, I remember this article at the time. This article is important in itself, and it's also important in, reflecting or prefiguring 1,000 other articles that took this same line of reasoning, took it further. And they might have been derivative of this article directly, because this article interviewed the author of a book who was celebrated or heralded as having written down many of these ideas before they happened. So in the middle of this interview, the link to this article is below this video. At many points in this article, I have to sort of cringe at the sort of spectacle of self-deception that's being indulged in here. But again, this is the year 2012. All right. The interviewer says, quote, "You point to 4 key moments in history: the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, and the Bolshevik revolutions. and then describe how the real revolution, the nonviolent one, took place in the hearts and minds of people in those countries. So this is what I want to emphasize. The ideology the Anglophone world created out of the Arab Spring, it didn't just rely on forcibly misinterpreting what was happening in the Arab world, all right? It's not just that it's drawing a false line in a constellation where the final link from some fine historical tradition is then connected to the present by a false or dubious line or step of inference, right? Each and every step is equally false. What are the four moments here mentioned? There's a fifth I'll come back to. It's actually in the paragraph prior to this, which is, of course, the fifth that's not mentioned here is Mohandas Gandhi in India and in South Africa, okay? The French Revolution. What kind of a lunatic could describe the French Revolution as nonviolent? The American Revolution. What kind of an imbecile, from what perspective, could you say anything about the American Revolution in its resolution, in its aims, and its objectives, and how it achieved them, is nonviolent? Who could use either of these revolutions as a symbol of or demonstration of the importance of nonviolence in achieving political change? These may be very grim and instructive chapters of history for us to reflect on the horrible importance of violence, of military discipline, and so on. The third example, I think, is just obscure to most people. The Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution in England, nobody talks about it anymore. You know why? Because it was basically about anti-Catholicism. It was one of many quote-unquote revolutions or, political events in England that fundamentally had to do with the struggle of Protestant against Catholics. So today we don't think of it that much. It involved war and armies and violence. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean this shows that the real revolution, the nonviolent one, took place in the hearts and minds of people? How can that possibly be the lesson of any of these? And then the fourth and final one, the Bolshevik Revolution. It doesn't even say the Russian Revolution. I'm sorry, because there's a significant difference here. Specifically, the takeover of power by the Bolsheviks in Russia. This is not merely a revolution, but also a civil war. This is unbelievably violent. Sadly, the lesson we would draw from these four examples that they've set out here is that violence and only violence matters. That the only thing that matters is who takes over. So as I've already given away, in the paragraph both before and after this, in the same article, there's a great deal of talk about Mohandas Gandhi and how what he represented is supposedly an ideal of nonviolence, okay? But what is the actual example? September of 1906 in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm sorry. What was Gandhi? What was Gandhi actually trying to achieve in South Africa? It wasn't the liberation of black people. It wasn't the liberation of Africans. You guys may not know this. The first thing he wanted was legal recognition of Hindu marriages. I'm sorry, I'm cursed. I've actually read the history here, unlike the various vegans and so on who tried to weaponize this ideology to make it into something convenient, okay? The second thing, what really made him famous, what really got him published in the newspapers and made his name notorious, was in the lead up to World War I. Gandhi was fighting against the racism of the British Army, and that the British Army only wanted white people fighting in the military, and he wanted ethnically Indian people, ethnically brown-skinned people from India, to be able to volunteer and fight for the British Empire in the army. In the end, he got a halfway concession. People of Indian ancestry in South Africa were allowed to play a support role. They were allowed to be something like a nurse or carry heavy equipment, but not to actually fight. So not only was there nothing nonviolent about the means, there's nothing nonviolent about the objectives or the ends, and he was in a caste system, in an apartheid system in South Africa. So it should never be forgotten. South Africa was not simply about the inequality of blacks and whites. There were many specific ethnic groups, including people from India, that each had their precise station in an incredibly racist and evil social system. And he was a lawyer who was an advocate for one of the moderately privileged people. He wanted them to be more privileged. He was not helping the upliftment of the weak and the poor. He was not helping the indigenous people or the blacks. He was not opposed to the British Empire. At that time, he was, in fact, hilariously wanting people of Indian ancestry to be able to volunteer for and fight for the Indian Empire. Now, look, guys, I'm not an expert. This is not my area of expertise. I don't care. This is not my passion in life. There are so many things I've researched to death, and everything we've covered in this video, I would even normally disclaim my ignorance of. And yet, I seem to be so much better informed than people like Wayne Seong, the leader of Direct Action Everywhere, people like the professional journalists at Mother Jones, people like the author of this book, Jonathan Schnell. There was this rotating cast of characters who back in the year 2011, 2012, 2013, at that time were appearing on respectable news programs like, BBC Hard Talk, so, British Broadcasting Service and so on. In very sober, serious voices, talking about how, yes, the Arab Spring proves once and for all that really the way to make political change is nonviolence. This is, like I say, the last star in the constellation in the sky that really sets out the way to change the world is through this nonviolent tradition of political protest that's somehow miraculously linked to Mohandas Gandhi in India. As if it were so easy to find something in common between, the struggle for India's independence from the British Empire and, veganism or ecology or wanting to have democracy in North Africa. It's just surreal, the comparison to begin with. And then, as I'm stating here, relatively succinctly in this YouTube video, what's interesting about the analysis is that it requires dishonesty. It requires a peculiar leap of faith from us at each and every stage of the analysis. All right? So as I disclaimed at the beginning of this video, I am not here discussing the reality of the Arab Spring at all. I am not discussing the significance of the Arab Spring from an Arab perspective, what it means for the people who are living today in Egypt. And one of the reasons I'm not doing that is I think all of those people are aware the Arab Spring was a failure. It was a catastrophe. It was a calamity. I was almost moved to tears where we saw an interview just via the internet, but it's a TV recorded interview with a man who had fought for democracy in the Arab Spring, but now his country is in such a constant state of internecine violence, descending into tribalism and so on. He said in his own voice that when he looks back now, he would have fought to maintain the despotism they had before instead of fighting for democracy if he'd had the knowledge that this was where democracy would lead, was to this, a horrible state of a war of all against all. To a much greater extent than the Vietnam War became a symbol in the minds of Americans, utterly divorced from and unrelated to the reality of the Vietnam War for the Vietnamese. The Arab Spring has taken on a significance in the white Western English-speaking imagination, completely divorced from the reality of what this meant for Arabic people in general, or Egyptian people in particular, Libyan people in particular, any of these examples you want to talk about. How is this possible in the year 2020 when the simple facts of the matter can be so easily Googled? I'm sorry, I don't know if this is a depressing or an uplifting note to end on. But guys, I can remember when I physically had to walk into an archive and go to a shelf nobody ever went to. It was the government publications section, and go through and find like the serial number, the document number. This wasn't secret information, but to get government information was this incredibly laborious task. And now I can Google around and in 30 seconds find things so much more effectively. And I can find the whole history of the prior documents and the revisions. And I can find an interview with the people who wrote that legislation and why it happened and so on. So much is knowable so immediately. But there's this kind of commitment people have to living in this dangerous mix of truth and fiction. People want to believe in this mythology. They want to believe in the myth of Mohandas Gandhi as the hero, as was presented in a Hollywood movie with, a Western actor playing the role of Gandhi. That movie is unbelievably far removed from the reality of who Gandhi was and what happened in his independence struggle. They want to believe in a myth. I'm just directly quoting this one article from Mother Jones. Mother Jones is supposed to be nonfiction. this myth that the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, and the Bolshevik Revolution, that those four all represent ideals of nonviolence in the pursuit of social and cultural change. To me, the most dangerous warning that we can at any time return to the horrors of the Bolshevik Revolution, that we can at any time return to the extreme violence that was indeed unleashed by the Arab Spring itself, is precisely that people are so willing, are so eager to live in a world that is not defined and not described by facts, where they don't learn the lessons of history, that they're so eager to commit themselves to mythology.